Every disappearance has a day before it. A day that looks like every other day until it isn't anymore. For the Hawley family, that day was the 9th of October, in a small town called Millbrook Hollow, tucked between pine ridges and a slow gray river in the northern hills. Nobody in Millbrook Hollow remembers that Friday as special. That is the strange thing about the last normal day. It never announces itself. Elena Hawley was 7 years old. She had brown hair cut short at the shoulders, a chipped front tooth from a bicycle fall the summer before, and a habit of narrating her own life out loud, as if she were the host of a show only she could see. Her mother, Rosalind Hawley, worked the early shift at the hospital pharmacy. Her father, Thomas Hawley, drove a delivery route that kept him on the road most days until early evening. Elena's world, in the fall of that year, was small and orderly. School, the walk home with a neighbor's older daughter, homework at the kitchen table, dinner, television, bed. On the 9th of October, Elena walked out of Millbrook Hollow Elementary at 3:15 in the afternoon, same as always. She was seen crossing the school parking lot by two teachers standing near the flagpole. She was seen again 4 minutes later by a crossing guard named Walter Pretty, who had worked that same corner for 11 years and knew every child by name. He said later that Elena waved at him, the way she always did, and called out that she was going the long way home because she wanted to look at the ducks by the creek. That was the last confirmed sighting of Elena Hawley. The walk from the school to the Hawley house took, by the short route, about 12 minutes. By the longer route past the creek, it took closer to 20. Elena had made that walk more than 100 times. She knew which yards had dogs that barked but never bit, which house had a porch swing she liked to look at, which stretch of sidewalk buckled from tree roots. It was, in every sense, familiar ground. At 4:40 that afternoon, Rosalind Hawley came home from her shift and found the house empty. This did not alarm her immediately. Elena sometimes stopped at a friend's house or lingered at the small park 2 streets over. Rosalind made a cup of tea and waited. At 5:15, she called the friend's house. Elena was not there and had not been there that day. At 5:30, she called 3 other families. No one had seen her daughter since school let out. By 6 o'clock in the evening, Rosalind Hall was walking the route herself, calling Elena's name into the growing dusk, checking the creek, checking the park, checking behind the hedges of houses she barely knew the owners of. By 6:45, she was standing in the Millbrook Hollow police station, her voice shaking, describing a route her daughter walked nearly every day of her life. A route that had, without warning, swallowed her whole. What happened in those minutes between the school gate and the front door of the Hawley house has never been fully answered. Not that day, not in the weeks after. Not, some would argue, to this day. But to understand how a child can vanish from a route she knew by heart, in a town where everyone claimed to know everyone else, we have to go back to the hours immediately after Rosalind Hale's call, because what the police found and what they didn't find would shape the next several years of a small town's uneasy relationship with its own sense of safety. The search would begin within the hour, and what searchers found in the first 24 hours would raise a question that still unsettles anyone who studies this case. How does a route so small, so known, so unremarkable hide a child so completely? Welcome back to Shelby's Den, the place where we dig into the cases that never made national headlines, but absolutely should have. If you're new here, we cover unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and stories that fell through the cracks of true crime coverage. So if that's your thing, hit subscribe and ring that bell, because we've got a lot more of these coming. Now, let's get back to the story. Police Chief Daniel Okonkwo had been in law enforcement for over 20 years, most of them in cities far larger than Millbrook Hollow. He had taken the chief's job in the small town partly because he wanted quieter work. He would later say, in an interview years afterward, that the Hawley case was the one that taught him quiet towns can hold the same darkness as anywhere else. They simply have fewer places to hide it. Within an hour of Rosalind Hale's report, Okonkwo had 4 officers walking the route between the school and the Hawley house. Volunteers began arriving before the sun had fully set. Neighbors, parents from the elementary school, members of the volunteer fire department. Flashlights swept the creek bank. Someone brought a search dog from the county over, a bloodhound named Copper, who had helped find 2 lost hikers the year before. Copper picked up Elena's scent at the school gate, followed it along the sidewalk, past 3 houses, and to the corner where the long route toward the creek diverged from the short route home. Then, at the edge of the creek path, Copper stopped. He circled, he whined, and then he sat down, refusing to go further. The universal signal handlers used to indicate a scent trail has ended. A scent trail ending at a specific point can mean several things. It can mean a person got into a vehicle. It can mean the trail was disrupted by water, by rain, by other people walking through the same area. It can mean, in the coldest and most difficult scenarios, that the trail simply degraded past what a dog can track. That night, searchers did not know which explanation applied. They only knew that a 7-year-old girl's scent stopped at the edge of a footpath on a dry evening, with no vehicle tracks visible in the soft dirt nearby. By midnight, 40 people had searched the creek, the nearby woods, 3 empty lots, and the yards of every house along both possible routes. No shoe, no backpack, no jacket. Elena had been wearing a yellow raincoat that morning, bright enough that even in fading light it should have been visible against the autumn brown of the underbrush. Nothing was found. Chief Okonkwo made a decision that night that some in the department questioned at the time, and many would later credit as crucial. He called in the state police before dawn. Rather than waiting the customary window some departments observe before treating a case as a possible abduction. A 7-year-old does not simply wander off a route she's walked 100 times, he said in a briefing the next morning, according to notes kept by a young officer named Priya Desai, who would go on to become one of the case's most dedicated investigators. We treat this as if every hour matters, because it does. By the second morning, Millbrook Hollow had transformed. State police cruisers lined the street outside the elementary school. A command post was set up in the fire station. News vans from 2 regional television stations arrived by noon. Flyers with Elena's school photo, gap-toothed smile, hair slightly mussed, wearing the yellow raincoat she had on the day she disappeared, were taped to every storefront window on Main Street within 24 hours. And yet, for all this mobilization, all this attention, all this manpower, the physical search turned up almost nothing. No sign of struggle. No blood, no torn clothing, no footprints beyond what dozens of searchers had already left in the dirt. It was as if Alana Hawley had simply stepped out of the world at the edge of that creek path, leaving no mark of her passing. Detective Priya Desai, then newly assigned to the case, would later describe the strange quiet of that scene. Cases like this usually have some point of violence you can find, some sign, even a small one, she said. This one had nothing, and nothing is its own kind of evidence. It told us whoever did this, if someone did this, was either very careful or very lucky. Neither one is comforting. By the end of the second day, investigators had a working theory, one they were careful not to share publicly. Elena had likely not wandered off, gotten lost, or fallen into the creek and been swept away. Since divers had already cleared the creek bed for a mile downstream, and the water level was too low, and too slow for a body to travel far, the absence of any accidental explanation left only one uncomfortable possibility remaining. Someone had taken her. But who? And why? In a town small enough that everyone thought they knew their neighbors, had no one seen a thing? That question would haunt the investigation for the following days, because the first person police would need to look at closely was someone far closer to Elena than any of them expected. In any disappearance, investigators begin close to home. It is not because they assume the worst of families. It is because, statistically and practically, the people closest to a missing child are the ones most likely to know something, whether they realize it or not. For the Hawley family, this meant that in the same week they were pleading publicly for their daughter's safe return, they were also being quietly, methodically investigated. Thomas Hale's delivery route on the day of Elena's disappearance was verified within 48 hours. GPS records from his company van placed him nearly 60 miles away at the time Elena vanished. Restocking shelves at 3 different retail locations, each confirmed by time-stamped receipts and by store employees who remembered him. He was, investigators concluded, not a plausible suspect, though the process of clearing him took time the family found excruciating. Rosalind Hale's hospital shift ended at 4:15, confirmed by a badge swipe and by 2 co-workers. She had driven directly home, a 15-minute drive confirmed by a gas station security camera that caught her car passing at 4:32. She, too, was cleared, though not before investigators had asked her, more than once, whether there had been any tension in the marriage. Whether Elena had ever mentioned being afraid of anyone, whether there was anyone at all, who might have wanted to hurt the family. It was during one of these interviews that Rosalind first mentioned a name that would occupy investigators for months: Gerald Voss. Gerald Voss lived 2 houses down from the Hawley family, an older man in his 60s who had lived alone since his wife's death several years earlier. He was, by most accounts, a quiet neighbor, the kind who kept his lawn tidy, waved at passing cars, and rarely spoke more than a few words to anyone. But Rosalind told detectives that in the weeks before Elena's disappearance, she had noticed Voss watching the children on the street more than seemed ordinary. She said Elena herself had mentioned offhand that the man with the white truck sometimes talked to her when she walked past his house, thought it was a small detail. It could have meant nothing, an old man being friendly or simply present in the way neighbors often are. But small details are the substance of investigations, and detectives moved on it quickly. A search of Voss's property, conducted with a warrant 3 days after Elena's disappearance, found nothing directly incriminating. No physical evidence connecting him to the crime, no trace of Elena in his home, garage, or vehicle. But it did uncover something troubling in a different sense. Voss had a prior record, sealed due to his age at the time of the offense decades earlier, involving inappropriate contact with a minor in a different state. It was old. It had been handled, according to the records, through a plea agreement and years of supervised parole long since expired. But its existence changed the entire shape of the investigation. For nearly 3 weeks, Gerald Voss became the focus of nearly every resource the investigation had. His movements on the day of the disappearance were reconstructed hour by hour. Neighbors were re-interviewed specifically about him. His phone records, his bank statements, his internet history, all of it was examined under warrant. And for those 3 weeks, Millbrook Hollow, a town of fewer than 4,000 people, effectively convicted him in the court of rumor before any formal charge was ever filed. But the case against Voss had a problem that would not go away, no matter how hard investigators pushed: his alibi. A home security camera belonging to a neighbor 3 doors down, angled toward the street, had captured Voss's white truck parked in his own driveway from 2:50 in the afternoon, before Elena had even left school, until well past 7 o'clock that evening. The timestamp was verified independently by the camera manufacturer's servo logs, which could not be altered without leaving a digital trace investigators specifically checked for. Voss had not left his driveway during the entire window in which Elena disappeared. It was, in the words of Detective Desai, one of the cleanest alibis I have ever seen, and also one of the most frustrating because it meant we had spent 3 critical weeks chasing someone whose past made him look guilty, while whoever actually took Elena had 3 additional weeks to disappear completely. The revelation that Voss could not have been involved did not clear him in the eyes of the town. Some residents never forgave him, and he would eventually sell his house and leave Millbrook Hollow entirely, a broken man pursued by suspicion he had not earned in this instance, carrying the weight of a past he could not undo. But for the investigation, his exoneration meant something worse than simply losing a suspect. It meant they were back at the beginning, with 3 weeks lost and a trail that had gone from cold to nearly frozen. And it was at this point, with the investigation stalled and the town's fear curdling into distrust of everyone around them, that a single piece of evidence resurfaced. Something that had been collected in the first 48 hours, but overlooked in the rush toward Gerald Voss. A piece of evidence that would, months later, become the thread that unraveled everything. It is a common and painful truth in investigations of this kind. The answer is sometimes present from the very beginning, sitting quietly in a case file, waiting for someone to look at it the right way. For the disappearance of Elena Hawley, that answer came in the form of a single grainy photograph, taken not by a professional camera, but by a doorbell security device belonging to a house on the long route between the school and the creek. The doorbell camera belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Iyer, who lived at the corner where the short route and the long route diverged, the very point where Copper the search dog had stopped and refused to continue. In the first days of the investigation, Margaret's camera footage had been collected and reviewed, but only briefly. The footage was low resolution, the angle awkward, and at first pass, nothing in it seemed relevant. It showed the corner of the street, a slice of sidewalk, and at the very edge of the frame, part of the road. At 3:19 in the afternoon on the day Elena vanished, 4 minutes after she was seen waving to the crossing guard, and well within the window of her disappearance, the camera had captured a vehicle passing slowly along that stretch of road. It was there for less than 3 seconds before leaving the frame. In the initial review, an officer had noted the vehicle's presence in the file, but marked it as unremarkable, likely local traffic, and moved on, because dozens of similar vehicles passed through Millbrook Hollow every day, and there was, at that time, no reason to suspect any particular one. It was Detective Desai, going back through the case file nearly 2 months later, out of what she would describe as simple stubbornness, who pulled the footage again. She had a technical analyst enhance the image using software the department had not had access to in the first weeks of the case, when their attention and resources were still fixed almost entirely on Gerald Voss. What emerged after enhancement was a partial license plate, 3 characters clearly visible, the rest obscured by motion blur and the low angle of the camera, and the make of the vehicle, a dark blue sedan with a distinctive roof rack. Uncommon enough in a town where most people drove trucks or older, more practical cars for the hilly terrain. Cross-referencing the partial plate and vehicle description against motor vehicle records for the county turned up 11 possible matches. Of those 11, 7 were immediately ruled out. Vehicles registered to elderly residents with no connection to the area, a vehicle that had been sold out of state the year before. 2 vehicles confirmed by their owners to have been elsewhere that day, verified independently. That left 4 vehicles. And one of those 4 belonged to a man named Curtis Renner, a maintenance contractor who had records showed, done occasional work at Millbrook Hollow Elementary School over the previous 2 years, repairing plumbing, fixing a broken boiler, replacing damaged flooring in the cafeteria. He was not a stranger to the school. He was, in fact, someone who had legitimate reason to be on school grounds, someone whose presence would not have raised alarm among staff or students, someone who, crucially, might have had the opportunity to become familiar with a child like Elena without ever raising suspicion. When detectives pulled Renner's employment records more closely, a detail emerged that sharpened their focus considerably. 2 years earlier, in a different county nearly 200 miles away, Renner had been investigated, though never formally charged, in connection with the disappearance of another child. A case that had gone cold and, in the absence of any physical evidence, had eventually stalled without resolution. The case had never made regional news. It had never been connected to Millbrook Hollow. It existed only as a note in a state database that most local departments would never think to cross-reference unless they were looking specifically for a pattern. Detective Desai would later describe the moment she found that connection as one of the most unsettling of her career. "You spend 2 months hoping the person who did this is a stranger passing through, someone who left and won't come back," she said. "And then you find out he might not be a stranger at all. He might be someone who has done this before and gotten away with it before and is still walking around, still working, still able to get close to children whenever he wants." The discovery of Curtis Renner's name changed everything about the direction of the investigation. But it also introduced a new and deeply frustrating problem. Renner had, by this point, left the state entirely, having taken a new maintenance contract nearly 400 miles away, 3 weeks after Elena's disappearance. A move his employer described as unusual, since Renner had never before taken work so far from his established client base. Was this simply coincidence? Or had Curtis Renner, sensing the walls closing in, run before anyone even knew to look for him? Locating him would prove to be only the beginning of a far longer and more difficult pursuit, one that would take investigators into a part of Curtis Renner's life no one in Millbrook Hollow could have imagined. Tracking Curtis Renner took the better part of 3 weeks, not because he was hiding in any dramatic sense, but because he had simply moved on with an ordinariness that made him difficult to flag. He had taken a job with a property maintenance company in a mid-sized city, rented a small apartment under his own name, and by all outward appearances was living an unremarkable life. He had not changed his name. He had not gone underground. This, investigators would later say, was in some ways more disturbing than if he had fled dramatically, because it suggested a man who did not believe he had anything to fear. When detectives from Millbrook Hollow, working alongside state investigators, finally located and approached Renner for questioning, he agreed to speak with them voluntarily, a decision his own lawyer would later say he regretted advising him toward. Renner denied any knowledge of Elena Hale's disappearance. He stated that he did recall doing maintenance work at Millbrook Hollow Elementary, but said he had not been in the town at all on the day Elena vanished. When asked to account for his whereabouts, he gave an address in the city where he was then living, claiming he had spent the day at home, alone, with no one able to confirm his account. This alone would not have been enough to charge him. An alibi that cannot be confirmed is not the same as evidence that it is false. But detectives had, by this point, done something Renner did not know about. They had obtained, through a warrant, the location data from his cell phone provider for the day in question. The data told a very different story than the one Renner had given. His phone had connected to a cell tower on the outskirts of Millbrook Hollow at 2:52 in the afternoon, roughly 20 minutes before Elena left school, and had remained connected to towers in and around the town until nearly 8 o'clock that evening. well after the search for Elena had already begun. Renner had not been at home alone, as he claimed. He had been in Millbrook Hollow for the entire critical window. Confronted with this data in a second interview, Renner's account shifted. He said he had, in fact, been in the area that day, doing what he described as scouting a potential job for future maintenance work, though he could produce no record of any such job. No contact at the school or elsewhere who could confirm this explanation, and no reasonable account of why he would have concealed a simple, legitimate visit if that was truly what it had been. It was at this point, with Renner's story collapsing under its own inconsistencies, that investigators uncovered the piece of information that would define the rest of the case. Working with detectives from the county where the earlier unresolved child disappearance had occurred 2 years prior, Priya Desai obtained access to the full case file on that investigation, a file that had never been made public, and that connected Renner to the earlier case far more directly than had previously been known. In that earlier case, a 6-year-old boy named Marcus Webb had vanished from a rural property where Renner had, at the time, been contracted to repair a barn roof. Marcus had never been found. The investigation into his disappearance had, like the early days of the Hawley case, initially focused on family members and neighbors, and had eventually stalled without ever seriously examining outside contractors who had been present on the property in the weeks before. Renner's name appeared in that file only once, in a routine list of workers who had been on site, a detail no investigator at the time had flagged as significant. But there was one more connection, buried deeper in the file. That turned this from a troubling coincidence into something far more damning. A rural mail carrier on the route near the Webb family's property had noted, in a statement given shortly after Marcus's disappearance and never followed up on, a dark blue sedan with a distinctive roof rack parked near the property on the morning the boy vanished. The description matched almost exactly a vehicle captured on Margaret Eyer's doorbell camera in Millbrook Hollow. 2 children, 2 years apart, 200 miles apart, and one man whose presence connected both cases, a man who had, until this point, never been formally suspected in either. The evidence was mounting, but it remained circumstantial. Cell tower data placed Renner in the area. An old, uninvestigated witness statement placed a similar vehicle near an earlier disappearance. None of it, on its own, proved that Curtis Renner had taken Elena Hawley or that he had ever harmed Marcus Webb. Investigators needed something more concrete, something that could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom, not just the suspicion of a case file. And it would take an unexpected turn, one involving neither cell towers nor security cameras, but a single object found in a place no one had thought to search, to finally bring the investigation to its breaking point. Nearly 4 months after Elena Hawley disappeared, investigators secured a warrant to search a small parcel of rural property that Curtis Renner had inherited from an uncle years earlier and had never sold, despite having no obvious reason to keep it. The property sat along a quiet stretch of Route 9, roughly 40 minutes outside Millbrook Hollow, close enough to reach easily, far enough to be entirely disconnected from Renner's known life in the town or the city where he currently lived. The land itself was modest, a few acres of overgrown field, a collapsing barn, and a small outbuilding that county records showed had been used decades earlier as a hunting cabin. Renner had never listed the property as a residence. He had, in fact, never mentioned it to investigators at all. It surfaced only because Desai, methodically working through every public record connected to his name, found the original inheritance filing from over a decade before. The search of the property, conducted by a team of state investigators alongside forensic specialists, took the better part of 2 days. The barn yielded nothing of immediate significance. Old tools, rusted farm equipment, the ordinary detritus of an abandoned structure. But the outbuilding told a different story. Investigators found evidence that the structure had been used far more recently than its outward decay suggested. A generator, still functional. Bedding materials that, while weathered, were not decades old. And in a locked cabinet inside, a collection of children's clothing that did not belong to any child associated with Curtis Renner's known family or acquaintances. Among that clothing was a small yellow raincoat. Forensic testing confirmed what investigators had feared and hoped for in equal measure. The raincoat matched, in every detail down to a small tear near the left cuff that Rosalind Hawley had mended herself months before Elena's disappearance. The coat Elena had been wearing on the day she vanished. Fiber and trace evidence recovered from the coat and from the interior of the outbuilding would, in the weeks that followed, be matched conclusively to Elena through DNA analysis. The discovery answered one question with devastating certainty. Elena Hawley had been at that property, but it did not answer the question that mattered most to her family, to the investigators who had spent 4 months chasing every lead, and to a town that had waited day after day for any sign of what had happened to their youngest resident. It did not tell them where Elena was now. The property was searched inch by inch. The surrounding woods were combed by cadaver dogs, whose training allows them to detect signs of decomposition even in cases where no visible remains are present. For 3 tense days, as news of the search spread and reporters began arriving from across the region, the town of Millbrook Hollow held its breath, bracing for the worst possible confirmation. But the cadaver dogs found nothing. No remains were recovered from the property, the surrounding woods, or the nearby fields. This left investigators with a result that was, in its own way, more agonizing than a confirmed tragedy would have been. Definitive proof that Elena had been held at this location, and no proof at all of what had happened to her afterward. Curtis Renner, when confronted with the discovery of the raincoat and the other children's clothing found at the property, invoked his right to remain silent and refused to answer any further questions. He was arrested and charged with kidnapping, though prosecutors acknowledged in private conversations with the Hawley family that without a body or a confession, securing a conviction on more serious charges would be an uphill battle. For Rosalind and Thomas Hawley, the discovery brought a crushing, contradictory wave of emotion. Confirmation that their daughter had been alive and present at that remote property months after her disappearance, paired with the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing what had become of her since. It was, in the words of a family friend who spoke to reporters at the time, the worst kind of answer, enough truth to break your heart all over again, and not enough truth to let you grieve or hope in any complete way. The clothing found in that locked cabinet belonged, investigators soon confirmed through comparison with other unsolved missing children's cases across 3 states, to at least 4 other children besides Elena and Marcus Webb, a discovery that transformed the case from the disappearance of a single child into something far larger and more disturbing than anyone in Millbrook Hollow could have imagined. And it raised the most urgent question of the entire investigation. If Curtis Renner had taken this many children over this many years, across this many jurisdictions no single department had ever connected, how many of them might still be alive, and how far would investigators have to go to find them? In the weeks following his arrest, Curtis Renner said almost nothing. He declined interviews with investigators. He spoke to his court-appointed attorney only in the barest terms necessary to prepare a defense. He offered no confession, no denial beyond his initial claim of innocence, and no indication of remorse, confusion, or explanation for what investigators had found at the Route 9 property. His silence became, in its own way, one of the most difficult obstacles of the entire case, because without his cooperation, the fate of Elena Hawley and possibly the fate of several other missing children, remained locked inside a man who showed no willingness to unlock it. Prosecutors, working alongside the Hawley family's legal counsel, attempted several approaches to break through that silence. They offered, through his attorney, a conditional arrangement, information leading to the recovery of any missing child, living or deceased, in exchange for consideration during sentencing. For weeks, Renner did not respond to the offer at all. It was during this period of agonizing silence that investigators turned to a different strategy, one rooted not in negotiation with Renner himself, but in a deeper excavation of his life in the hope that his own history might reveal what he refused to say. Detective Desai, along with a small task force assembled from 3 different state jurisdictions, began the painstaking work of reconstructing Renner's movements over more than a decade. Cross-referencing his employment records, vehicle registrations, and phone data against every unsolved child disappearance in a 5-state region. The picture that emerged was methodical in a way that chilled even experienced investigators. Renner's employment as a traveling maintenance contractor had given him legitimate, unremarkable reasons to be present in dozens of small towns over the years, repairing school boilers, fixing plumbing in community centers, doing seasonal work on rural properties. In town after town, his presence would have seemed entirely ordinary, a workman doing an honest job, forgettable in the way that background figures in daily life so often are. And in at least 6 of those towns, a child had vanished, or nearly vanished, within weeks of his documented presence. Not every one of these cases could be conclusively tied to Renner. Some occurred in periods where his exact location could not be verified. Others involved children who were eventually found alive, having wandered off or been involved in circumstances unrelated to any predator. A reminder investigators were careful to hold on to, that not every troubling pattern indicates the same cause, and that jumping to conclusions in cases like this can do as much harm as jumping to none. But in 3 of the 6 towns, including Millbrook Hollow and the county where Marcus Webb had disappeared, investigators found direct, verifiable evidence connecting Renner's presence to the moment a child went missing. Faced with this mounting body of evidence that made clear his silence was no longer protecting him from suspicion, only from the possibility of leniency, Curtis Renner's attorney requested a private meeting with prosecutors. What emerged from that meeting was not a full confession, but something investigators would later describe as a partial, reluctant admission, offered only in exchange for a formal agreement regarding his eventual sentencing. Renner acknowledged, through his attorney, that he had been present at the Route 9 property with Elena Hawley for a period of time following her disappearance. He would not describe, even in this limited admission, the exact nature of what had occurred there, and he refused, even under the pressure of the agreement being negotiated, to say definitively whether Elena Hawley was alive or dead. It was a half answer to a question that had consumed an entire town for months, enough to confirm the worst fears of what he had done, and not enough to bring any resolution to what had happened after. For Rosalind Hawley, learning of this partial admission was, she would later say, one of the most difficult moments of the entire ordeal. "You spend months hoping for answers," she said in an interview given nearly a year after her daughter's disappearance. "And then you get an answer that isn't really an answer at all. He knows. He knows exactly what happened to my daughter. And he has decided that his silence is worth more to him than my need to know." The investigation had reached a threshold few cases ever cross. Enough evidence to charge. Enough to convict on some counts, but not enough, without Renner's full cooperation, to give the family of Elena Hawley the one thing they wanted more than any arrest or courtroom verdict: the truth of what had happened to their daughter and where she was now. It would take one more discovery, made almost by accident nearly 8 months after Elena's disappearance, to finally begin closing that gap. The break, when it came, did not come from Curtis Renner at all. It came from a hiker. In late spring of the following year, a man named Douglas Farrow was hiking an unmarked trail roughly 6 miles from the Route 9 property, in a stretch of forest that had never been part of the original search area, because nothing in the investigation up to that point had suggested any connection between that location and Curtis Renner's known movements. Farrow, an experienced outdoorsman familiar with the region, noticed what he described as an area of disturbed earth beneath a rock outcropping, unusual enough in its shape and location that he took photographs before continuing his hike, later reporting what he had seen to local authorities out of an abundance of caution rather than any specific suspicion. It took investigators several days to connect Farrow's report to the ongoing case, and several more to secure the resources necessary to properly excavate the site. When they did, what they found would finally, agonizingly, bring a measure of resolution to a case that had haunted Millbrook Hollow for nearly a year. The site contained human remains, which forensic examination would eventually confirm, through DNA analysis conducted over the following weeks, belonged to Elena Hawley. The location was significant for reasons beyond the discovery itself. Cell tower data, when re-examined against this new site, showed that Curtis Renner's phone had connected to towers near this specific stretch of forest on 2 occasions in the weeks following Elena's disappearance. Trips that had gone unexamined in earlier stages of the investigation because, at the time, investigators had no reason to focus on that particular location. It was only the accidental discovery by a hiker, months later, that drew attention back to a pattern that had been sitting in the data all along. Confronted with this discovery, and with forensic evidence now directly tying him to the location through fiber and trace evidence recovered from the site, Curtis Renner's resistance finally broke. In a lengthy interview conducted with his attorney present, he provided what investigators would describe as a fuller, though still incomplete, account of what had occurred. He described taking Elena from the Creek Path route on the afternoon of her disappearance, holding her at the Route 9 property for a period of approximately 6 weeks, and ultimately causing her death when he became convinced, based on details he offered only in fragments, that the increasing attention on the case made it too dangerous for him to continue holding her. He also confirmed, in this same interview, his involvement in the disappearance of Marcus Webb 2 years earlier, and provided information that would eventually lead investigators to a second gravesite, several hundred miles away, that would resolve that earlier, long unsolved case as well. For the town of Millbrook Hollow, the discovery brought the ending that no one had wanted, but that many had, in their private hearts, come to expect as the months dragged on without a living recovery. Rosalind and Thomas Hawley held a memorial for their daughter attended by nearly the entire town, a gathering that Chief Okonkwo would later describe as the moment Millbrook Hollow finally, painfully, began to grieve as a community rather than search as one. Curtis Renner was ultimately convicted on multiple counts related to the deaths of Elena Hawley and Marcus Webb, along with additional charges connected to evidence recovered from the Route 9 property, linking him to other unresolved disappearances across several states. He was sentenced to serve the remainder of his life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that brought a measure of legal closure to a case that had, for nearly a year, seemed as though it might never resolve at all. But convictions, investigators, and families in cases like this one will tell you are not the same as closure. And for Millbrook Hollow, the questions raised by Elena Hale's disappearance, about vigilance, about the limits of a small community's ability to protect its own, about how a man could move quietly through so many lives across so many years without raising the alarm that might have stopped him sooner, would linger long after the courtroom doors closed. In the years since Elena Hale's disappearance and the eventual resolution of her case, Millbrook Hollow has changed in ways both visible and quiet. The town installed additional streetlights along the routes children walk to and from school. The elementary school implemented a stricter check-in and check-out system, requiring verified adult pickup for every child rather than relying on the informal trust that had once defined how families in a small town managed their daily lives. Walter Pretty, the crossing guard who was the last person to see Elena before her disappearance, continued in his post for several more years before retiring, telling a local reporter that he thought of Elena every single day he stood at that corner, and that he had made it his mission in the years remaining to him to know every child on his route by name and to notice, always, when something seemed different. Detective Priya Desai, whose persistence in returning to overlooked evidence ultimately cracked the case open, went on to specialize in cold case investigations, working with several state agencies to develop better systems for cross-referencing the movements of contract and transient workers against unsolved disappearances, a direct response, she has said publicly, to how long it took investigators to connect Curtis Renner's pattern across jurisdictions that had no reason, under the systems in place at the time, to ever compare notes with one another. Rosalind and Thomas Hawley have, in the years since, become advocates for improved interagency communication in missing children's cases, testifying before state legislative committees about the gaps that allowed a man like Curtis Renner to move undetected between towns and counties for as long as he did. They have spoken, too, about the particular anguish of the months when Elena's fate remained unknown, a period they describe as teaching them that uncertainty is its own distinct form of grief, different from and in some ways harder than the grief that follows confirmed loss, because it offers no path toward acceptance, only an endless, exhausting vigilance against hope, curdling into despair and back again. Gerald Voss, the neighbor whose old record made him the focus of the investigation's difficult early weeks, never fully recovered his standing in the community, despite his complete exoneration. He moved away from Millbrook Hollow within a year of the case's resolution, and few in the town have heard from him since, a quiet reminder that the damage caused by a wrongful suspicion, even one pursued in good faith and corrected in time, does not simply disappear once the truth comes out. Curtis Renner remains incarcerated and has, in the years since his conviction, declined every request for further interviews. Investigators believe, based on the pattern of his movements over more than a decade, that there may be additional victims whose cases remain unresolved, connected to towns and disappearances that have not yet been matched to his known history. The work of reviewing those old case files in departments across several states continues quietly in the background of an investigation that, for the public, ended the day Curtis Renner was sentenced, but that for the investigators who worked it, has never entirely closed. What the case of Elena Hawley reveals, in the end, is not a single lesson so easily summarized, but a set of harder truths about how communities protect or fail to protect their most vulnerable members. It reveals how a routine, familiar walk home can become the site of an unimaginable crime, not because a town failed to care, but because vigilance is difficult to sustain against a danger that does not announce itself, that wears the ordinary face of a workman fixing a boiler or a neighbor watching from a porch. It reveals how quickly suspicion can fall on the wrong person, and how carefully investigators must weigh circumstantial darkness against the deeper, more elusive patterns that connect a crime across time and distance. And it reveals, most painfully, that even when an investigation succeeds, even when the truth is eventually found, and the person responsible is eventually held accountable, the family left behind does not get their daughter back. They get only the truth, and the truth, however necessary, is never quite enough. Millbrook Hollow today is by most outward measures a quiet town again. The creek still runs slow past the path where a 7-year-old girl once walked to look at the ducks on an ordinary Friday afternoon in October. Children still walk that route to school, though fewer of them walk it alone now, and the streetlights installed in the years after Elena's disappearance still burn every evening, a small, steady defense against the darkness that once arrived without warning, and that the town has vowed, in the only way it can, never to be caught unprepared for again. If you enjoyed this original mystery story, like the video, subscribe for more, and turn on notifications for future psychological thrillers, unsolved mysteries, and fictional true crime-inspired tales. Until next time, sleep carefully.